Welcome to our lecture on modernism and modernist poets. This is going to be at least a two-part. We'll see if I can't do it in two, but maybe a three-part video lecture. But the first one is going to be about modernism as a movement. The others we're going to cover some poets that I've asked you to read for this week. Now, we just left realism as a movement, and it had certain characteristics that you should be familiar with by now. We've read some examples. I'm going to go into the next era or movement, which is known as modernism. And modernism, at its heart, as you can see, seeks to provide an alternate way of seeing reality that takes as its starting point the idea that reality itself is only understandable on an individual basis in fragments, discrete units, or individual experiences, images, or elements. That's my definition. You can look up 1,000 others, but let me break it down for you. Realism asks the question, what is the world really like? Not what I would like it to be like, not what fairy tales and storybooks tell me it should be like, but what is it really like? Modernism goes a step further, if you will, and among many other things, you can do an entire class on modernism. People do have them. We don't have that kind of time. But among other things, the question of this next era, right? Between the wars is a good way to put it, between World War I and World War II, is to say, well, now wait a minute. If one of the great goals of art, including literature, music, what have you, is to understand the world the way it is, how can I do that since I'm only one person? Isn't it true that all I can really do is convey my experience of reality, and yours might be different? And beyond that, I have very limited opportunities for perception. I mean, my experiences themselves are limited. Yours are too. I can't experience what you've experienced. You can't experience what I've experienced. And so one metaphor that you might think about when you think about modernism and the goal of that sort of art, whether it's literature or paintings or sculpture or architecture or whatnot, is to describe a facet of reality. It's a narrower view than realism, which is, I'm going to paint the world the way it really is. That sort of presupposes that you already know the world the way it really is. How can you know more than your own set of experiences? And so modernist writers say, no. My understanding of reality is fragmented. It's fractured. It's kind of like a mosaic with all the little pieces, but I don't have all the little pieces. I only have some of the pieces. So one of the things that modernist works do is they try to work out that individual experience through characters or narrators that have maybe limited perceptions. And of course, a lot of this is brought about, modernism that is, because of World War I. Again, the Civil War had a big influence on the development of realism from 1865 to about 1914 or so. And from about in the 19-teens all the way through the 1940s, that's why we say between the wars, but it's really broader than that. But about that time, right? First 4 decades, the second, third, fourth, and fifth decades of the 20th century, modernism was influenced by people who said, everything we've been told about reality, I'm not so sure about anymore. So the simplicity of modernist design in architecture and furniture, and down below you'll see modernist furniture, modernist architecture. They want to go with simplicity, things that are understandable, clean lines, straight lines. You and I might look at it and say, well, that's pretty plain. Right, but it's understandable. It's pure. It's its most basic essence. A sofa in its most basic form, a home in its most basic form, a building in its most basic form. The elemental pieces of it that are understandable. Other artwork is sort of trying to capture the individual experience in other ways. So you can look at Persistence of Memory down below there by Salvador Dali, which is a surrealist work. So I know reality through my dreams, through my subconscious. Right? So all these weird kind of almost looking like they're drug-induced paintings that Dali wants. He's very interested in the dream state and our subconscious. And because that's how surrealists believe we understand reality. Or people like Picasso and Guernica, which is this kind of bits and pieces of reality as they understand it. And we have to piece all of that together. Very, very basic. People think that people like Picasso couldn't paint realistic, right, paintings. Take a look at Picasso's early stuff, the Blue Period. He was an incredibly talented painter. He chose to paint in a more what we would call abstract style because he had something to say through that about our perceptions, about what we can know, about how we understand things. Or Thomas Hart Benton, for example, who takes pieces of reality as he sees it of urban life and sort of puts it together as a pastiche, as you see in the other painting there. He's not trying to tell you a story because he doesn't have all the elements of a story. He's just got impressions, pieces, bits, things he's seen. And taken together as a whole, you or I or some other viewer can walk away from that and say, I have an understanding of that city. I have an understanding of that event, Guernica, which was basically the fascists' bombing of a city in the north of Spain. I have an understanding of what you're telling me reality is like and how it's influenced by the dream state or the subconscious state, Mr. Surrealist. Okay? So it sounds very complicated, but it really isn't. It's not complicated at all. It starts from the premise that reality is only knowable from our own individual perspective, and art is about sharing those individual perspectives. So the writers of the period were also experimenting with subjects and techniques and forms that challenge the very assumptions of how we construct knowledge out of experiences. That's really important there. A lot of the literature that you read is going to be literature that says, here is one person, one character, one voice telling you what they saw. You cannot assume that that's the only way to look at things. So you might have a narrator who's narrating events that happened to him or her, and you and I say, I don't think this narrator really knows how important this event was that they're telling us about, right? That happens to you with conversations, doesn't it? It's perfectly possible that you're having lunch with a friend who's telling you about her relationship and how it's falling apart, and you say, well, that's your take on it, but what I'm hearing is maybe there's more to this than you've appreciated, even though she's the one relaying the circumstances. So you get the idea, right? So it's all about how we construct knowledge out of these experiences and out of these impressions. Also, very important. Modernism is an important movement, but it takes place in a really exciting and interesting period of history. We've nicknamed the 1920s, for example, the earlier part of modernism, as the Jazz Age, because so many wonderful cultural fusion events are taking place. You've got different ethnicities and different nationalities coming together. You've got a sort of an international movement of modernism. You did with realism and romanticism as well, but things are changing at such a rapid pace. I want you to think about what life would have been like for somebody who was born in, say, 1900 and lived all the way to a full life of, say, living to 98, right, and died in 1998. Maybe they lived for 98 years, 1900 to 1998. Think about that. That person went from horse and carriage and maybe a few people in town having a telephone, but that was really, really modern, all the way through the radio, the television, and finally the internet as a way to communicate. They went from riding horses to sending satellites and sending people to the moon and visiting Mars and the Hubble telescope. They went from a world that was just very, very small to one that was rapid, that was really fast, where it was the norm to fly across continents and oceans. They went from a world where you had to do all kinds of daily chores with manual labor to a life that was operating machines to do these things for us. And so the 20th century was an amazingly rapid changing century. And the period we're talking about here, modernism, was the period in which that change was just getting started. The idea that you were born and you didn't even think human beings could fly, and then by the time you die, people are visiting different planets, right? Or are getting ready to anyway. Certainly the moon. Just a phenomenal period. So this was the dawn of that period of rapid change that we're still, experiencing, but that was very new for these peoples. And that's going to have an effect. So the war would have an effect. Realism's legacy of wanting to present literature that described reality, life as it is, but with a more circumscribed, hey, how do I know what reality is? I only know what reality is for me. And then an era of rapid change. And when we look at the cultural events that were also important for the period, World War I, obviously, but hey, since we go to a university that's historically championed the education of women, it's important to stop and say, hey, what happened with women during this time? Because this is a big, big era of women's rights, women's suffrage, and this idea of the modern woman of the 1920s emerges. The war changed the American psyche, but also the war ushered in the American century. Prior to the 19 teens and 20s, the United States was a growing power economically, but it was not a world player when it comes to politics or the military or the economy. The British were still the primary power. The primary currency, the dominant currency in the world was the British pound. After World War I, that all changes. It all changes, and it's the United States that becomes the dominant world power. It's the United States that becomes the dominant economic power. Not so much military, because we sort of disarmed, but it was the United States that culturally became the dominant influence in the world through most of the 20th century. And I would argue probably still today, though we're a much more sort of evenly divided world in terms of cultural influences, and that'll probably be the case for the rest of our lives, I think. But one of the big events that happens in the 1920s, well, in 1920s, is the passage of the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote and was a reflection of, and also a catalyst for, the changing role of women's role for women in our society. Women's status changed, their position changed, and this began to be reflected both in characters in literature and in film, the new art form, right? Remember, there wasn't any, if you were born in 1900, there really wasn't a motion picture. There kind of was, but really wasn't. This idea of movies was, something, it was bizarre and exotic and strange. But you begin to see cinema icons and young women like Louise Brooks down below in the middle and Clara Bow just to her right. And these were different kinds of young women. It's mostly young women, by the way, women in their teens and 20s and maybe early 30s. We began to call them flappers, right? But that was the minorities, the drinking, fast living, dancing gal who lived a carefree life. That was a pretty small minority. But what was not a minority was the rise of young women as sort of the new woman, a woman in her teens and 20s, and you can see down below there in the center there the 5 young women who dressed differently than their parents, who acted differently, who lived differently, and especially as single young women, carved out lives and careers of their own. Maybe not to the extent as today, but they would have been seen as very different from their Victorian era mothers, who would never go out even in public unaccompanied or without a man. They wouldn't have made decisions without men in their lives. So there's this generation of young women that grow up, and many of them become writers, you see, especially in the modernist movement. Down in the bottom right, you have Dorothy Parker surrounded by all these men, right? The writers' circle that she was a part of in New York were mostly men, but she held her own with them, and she was a sort of new. So there was this idea of the new woman, new young woman in the 1920s and 30s who was more independent, who demanded more of a say in her life and how she would live it. Many of them sought higher education at schools like Texas Women's University, right? I mean, we're a little older than that. We were founded in 1901, but there were plenty of young women who decided, I think I'd like to go to college, and their mothers never did. I think I would like to have a career, and their mothers maybe didn't have that, and they wanted their own independence, and they wanted the vote, and they wanted all of these things. They had to have more control over their destiny. And you have an entire generation of young women, and of course that caused the powers that be a great deal of anxiety. Oh, good Lord, what's going to happen to our country if every young woman between the ages of, say, 18 and 28, for example, decides they're going to live their own way, why then we'll have chaos and Armageddon and the world will end, right? Well, it turns out that didn't happen, of course, but it certainly caused a great deal of controversy and in some corners anxiety about the so-called woman question, which is, to us, seems a little silly these days, but hey, at that time it was very serious. What is going to happen to the American family? What's going to happen to American society? What's going to happen to the professions if it's time now to make room for women in making decisions about everything? And of course, the vote in 1920, the passage of the 19th Amendment, the vote is really just kind of an indication of how things were changing. It didn't bring about all these changes, but it was a reflection of what was going on. So I just want you to bear that in mind. It's an era that was the beginning, really. You could actually argue that the 20th century didn't begin until about 1915 if you want to make that argument. It sounds weird, but you could make that argument because it was the beginning here in the 19-teens and 20s and 30s of a century of very dominant American cultural influence within the world. And as a piece of that, the question of where do women fit into that role? Is now the time to make fundamental changes in the lives of women? And part of that too, technology helped that. Technology helped that because as we're inventing more and more items, machine-made things, industrial-made things that liberated women from the drudgery of things like housework. I mean, they invented washing machines, which was a tremendous advancement in the lives. You can't. If I had to say what was the one invention that helped women the most in the early 20th century to improve the quality of their lives, it would probably be the washing machine. Because think about doing washing by hand and lugging it and toting it down to a creek, and it was just horrible. It was like living in the Stone Age. When the washing machine came along, just hours of labor went away. It was just magnificent. And then when you had actual refrigerators come along, and then better stoves, not wood stoves, not coal stoves, but electric or gas stoves, where you didn't have to lug the coal and lug the wood. I mean, think about all of those improvements. By the 1930s and 40s, women's lives were just transformed. Housework became much less tedious, much less physically onerous, much less dangerous. I mean, you could light the house on fire with some of this stuff. And that also freed up women to have more time for their families or more time for leisure, but most importantly, more time to say, wait a minute, what if I got a job? What if I pursued my passion? What if I decided to pursue a career? And they could. Technology, the Industrial Revolution in the United States helped bring that about, as well as the economic prosperity and the growth of urban areas and these kinds of things. So I just want you to think about the fact that so much changed in the 20th century, but especially in the first half of the 20th century, it caused a complete cultural and social revolution. And nowhere was that revolution more profound in terms of its impact than with the role of women in the society. And you're going to see that as a characteristic of modernism, right? So next we're going to deal with the poets that I have assigned for us, and then we'll go from there.